We can. Okay. All right. Thanks, everyone. We'll go ahead and start the 180-400 Sub-Basin Implementation Committee for May 2025. Can we get a roll call?
Yes, and I'll start with the 180-400.
Yeah.
Committee member Barnes,
Here.
Bramers,
Here.
Breen,
Here.
Bunn.
Here.
I think I heard here.
Here. Sorry.
Please
Thank
remember
you.
to use your microphones. Yeah, thank you.
Granillo.
She will be arriving at 1:30.
Okay, thank you. LeBeau,
Not here.
Lopez,
Here.
Mr. Marinhart. Let me check. He did indicate he was going to be remotely, but I don't see him signed in yet. Schettini,
Here.
Secundo,
Here.
Stefani,
Here.
and committee member Van Horn.
Here.
Okay, you have a quorum for the 180-400. I will proceed to the east side. Balmasia,
Not here yet.
Bunn,
Here.
Shabani,
Here.
Franchoni,
Here.
McIntyre,
Not present. Coming later, though.
Pereira,
Not present.
Oh, not present.
thank you. Ponce,
He's on his way.
Roberts,
Absent.
Robbins,
Here.
Rotishi,
Here.
and committee member Sanchez.
Here.
Okay, you have a quorum.
Great, thank you very much. So we'll call the meeting to order. Had a roll call. We have any additions or deletions to the agenda for either meeting?
Nope.
Okay. So we'll open for public comments, and we've asked that all members of the public restrict comments to 3 minutes or less, and you'll be providing a timer. Is that correct?
And that will apply to both the 180-400 and the east side for the duration of the meeting. So if there's any public comment not on the agenda,
And I'm not showing any raised hands online.
I don't see any in the room, so we'll go ahead and close public comment. I do see business for both agendas. There is none, so we can move right into item 4 discussions. 4.1 demand management planning for uncertainty. So Sarah, go ahead. You have some news, right?
Yeah, so our facilitator, Dave Sepos, was not able to join us. He had a potential food poisoning incident, not to reveal too much information, but that's why he's not with us today. So I'm going to step in. I'm not going to claim to be the facilitator that he is, but I'm going to try to help facilitate the discussion today to give our chairs an opportunity to participate and not try to manage the meeting. We are here today to continue the discussion that we started on April 14th related to demand management. We have our consultants with us today from ERA Economics, Duncan McEwen and Brooks Ronsby. Duncan will have the slides that we started last time. So all of the agenda materials that you received for this meeting are the same materials that were for the April 14th meeting. And we didn't get that far into all of the slides and discussion. So what we wanted to focus on today were a couple of particular areas of questions that Mr. Sepos sent out to the committee members yesterday to give some food for for thought ahead of the meeting, related to some of the concepts that we're proposing, both the structure of a framework, the concepts of stages and triggers, and an implementation timeline for when certain measures would be enacted, and then a proposed set of demand management measures. So what we're planning to do in the next 90 or so minutes is continue on with the slides that Duncan had started, and start just very briefly with the demand management framework outline, and then spend some time with the implementation timeline and these concepts of stages and triggers. And we'll start there. We'll take public comment on that part of the discussion. And then after that section, we'll move into the actual proposed measures and the information that ERA has put together on the costs and benefits and considerations for different demand management measures. And we'll have some discussion around that. So we'll have a couple discussion points, not trying to have it be too heavy just on a presentation and slides. So we're looking forward to hearing from all of you and continuing this conversation. So Duncan, take it away.
All right, on we go. So the good news is there's nothing new from last time. So we've got an hour and a half to have plenty of discussion. And I mean, obviously there's been work that's been done on some of these things, including some of the questions that were posed last time, but that's not information that we're focused on here today. We're just trying to get through the content in the, to go over this framework, to go over the staging, phasing, triggers concept. And then we'll dive into the 6 measures that we've got in there for demand management actions that are going to get rolled into this framework. And then obviously we're working on costs and benefits, doing the economic analysis of those. There's a lot of questions there. So let's have some good discussion today and we can, move forward with our work for you all.
Just to note that committee member Balmeja has arrived. Thank you.
Oh,
And
sorry
committee
to
member
interrupt. Also committee member Marion Hart has joined.
And committee member McIntyre. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, on we go. So, so there's a few things that we're working on, in parallel, and they're all related to demand management. And one of the pieces that we'll be putting together is this demand management framework. So we talked about this a bit last time, and just to come back to it, the goal isn't to get, everything done through like a contracting process and have like enforcement and measuring and monitoring and all these things figured out that would go with any piece of a demand management program that you would implement, like a fallow bank or a rotational fallowing program or whatever it is, right? There's a whole bunch of things that need to get set up. That's part of the implementation step. Our work at this stage is to lay out the framework, like what are the elements that are being considered? When would those be triggered? And then you would be working on those implementation steps. So I'll try to mention that a few times just to like kind of keep, hopefully we can kind of keep the questions targeted at the right level, given what we're trying to work on at this stage in the analysis, right? It's putting together this framework. So what is in the framework? So again, we'll have an overview of what demand management is. We'll have this problem statement, what are the issues at kind of a basin-wide level? What are the sustainability conditions that are driving it? Why are we here? It'll be a short section. It'll just say Sigma, and then we'll move on. But there'll be some other components to it that we want to lay out. The big piece of the framework is split into 4 sections. So conditions, what are the land use conditions? What are water supply conditions? Economic, demographic conditions. This is the big chunk of the work that, this is initially what we started on working for you all, right? Is what is the cost of using less water? Well, it depends on how you do it. So we need to define what those measures are. And we need to understand what those direct costs are, as well as the regional economic implications. So that goes into this kind of baseline conditions, like what's the situation that we're managing. Then we have the components. These are kind of things that are global and would apply across the demand management framework. We'll talk about stages and triggers in depth, but how is any given element of the demand management framework managed? Who administers it? Who sets rules and so forth? How was this framework, or how were the components of the framework selected? How do those fit with other projects that are being implemented? Is this cost effective, right? Like, are you getting best bang for your buck for groundwater management to comply with Sigma? Water measurement and accounting, how do you actually ensure that you're getting savings? This has been a big discussion that's come up at the 3 prior meetings that we've been at, right? So, if you impose measures in one area, how does that affect land use decisions in other parts of the valley? How does that affect land use decisions within a specific subbasin? And we've been doing some work on that. We had some discussions last time. But what's the framework so that you can ensure that you're getting savings? And then we've got 2 components of measures, of things that you're actually doing, like the actual tangible demand management actions that you're implementing, things that are incentive driven, right? Sometimes we talk about these as like voluntary. And then for each of these, we need to go through what they are. We're going to talk about these today. There's 5 of them that have made the short list. And this comes from work that you all have done going back to the planning for uncertainty workshops before we started working on this in 2023 and 24. And then the discussions that we've had in the committee meetings leading up to it. So look at the feasibility, what's the incentive structure, how do you pay for it, rules, enforcement. But again, those things aren't all defined. It's just you lay out what those pieces that need to get implemented are. And then for pumping limit based measures, some type of an allocation type system, same thing. How would that allocation work? What would the rules be? How do you enforce it? What's the cost? And how is that implemented? And when is it triggered? And then implementation. So the main things that we're focused on in today's meeting, which again is picking up from where we left off last time. We're not actually covering the problem statement. We talked about that last time. We're focusing on the measures. There's 6 of them that we want to go through, make sure that we've got everything on the list. Really there's 5, and then there's the pumping allocations approach. And then we're going to, in just a second, talk about the implementation timeline. So this concept of having phases and stages with different triggers to help prioritize when certain measures are implemented, right? One way to do that would be to look at like, what's the cheapest things, right? Maybe those are stuff that you prioritize first, but part of the discussion today is to get feedback on what these different what the prioritization should look like and what some of these stages and phases could look like. Okay, Sarah, is there anything that we wanted to ask about on just the general kind of framework? I think just going back to, we spent a little bit of time at our last meeting, there was some confusion about like, is this thing going to get us all the way to implementation? And the short answer to that is no. We'll have a document that lays out all of the steps and the components and the economics of the things that are getting included in this plan. But there's still, a good lift to develop any specific program and actually implement it. Obviously, we're not going to set up groundwater allocations in the next couple of months. So,
Yes, I think just to add and clarify that, if you could go back to that outline. So by this fall, what we would like to bring to our board, what we intend to bring to our board is this outline. But the sections, particularly under C and D and E, those will not be fully fleshed out for each of the measures. Just want to be clear that it's not going to be possible to completely build this out in that timeline, but that will identify what are the measures that are proposed to be included, and then these components of the implementation timeline and stages and triggers that will then set the framework for the work that will need to be done to implement individual measures over time in the coming years. And some of these things might take more than a year to actually develop how the program would work. So we want to hear questions about the measures. We want to hear questions about things or comments about things that we are going to need to consider in that program development. But we also want to stay away from getting into the weeds on them too much, because that's not the focus today. Our focus today is on the proposed measures themselves, and then on the implementation timeline, which is the next section. So at this point, does anybody have any questions about this outline? Go ahead, Bridget.
When are we going to be able to review all the other things you have here?
So today we're going to go through all of the measures and we're going to go through the stages and triggers concepts. The measures themselves and the building out of how they will work will not be something we're trying to accomplish by the fall.
I just mean the other bullet points.
So some of these bullet points, let's just take item C, for example. And give me an example of one of the.
Oh, well, fallow bank. is
So
one.
a fallow bank as an example. And so we'll be identifying the measures, we'll be discussing the feasibility, but the incentive structure, the funding strategy, the rules for how it would work, how it would be enforced, those would be things that would need to be developed following the adoption of the framework itself, which is, are these the right measures to develop a program for? That's the overarching question that we're going to be presenting to our board this fall.
Okay, and then is there going to be any discussion on whether or not we should add or edit the current bullet points on each of the A, B, C through A?
So yes, so components A and B, the information that Duncan is working on now, that's what we'll be bringing to the next meeting, is more details on those things. So more about the economic, go ahead.
I just wanted to clarify, was the question like, I mean, if you're looking at this and being like, and seeing something that's missing, I guess that would be good to discuss now. And then, or is the question about when we'll have that done? I mean, that's what we're working on now as part of this framework.
No, it's like if I guess like the items that it's a little, and maybe it's just me, but for me, it's just so vague. It's hard to give any feedback on it because if you're looking at this as like the bones of like your process, that's fine. But it's so vague. I don't know how you're planning on applying these concepts, so that it gets really hard to give any feedback. I guess like, yeah, for any of these things though, if we thought that something else should be considered as part of the bones to how you're doing things, then I think maybe it would be worth having a conversation about that.
Yeah. I mean, and I think that's feedback that would be good to discuss today. I mean, this is having been through a couple of these, and I mean, I think we check most of the boxes, but that's the question for the room is like, are you looking at this and you see like, yeah, like where are we going to address X, Y, and Z? I think X, Y, and Z is on there. So if something, if that's the question is like, if you're seeing something, you're like, well, where is this addressed? Let's flag that now, and we can make sure that it's in our outline. But yeah, this is a skeleton. It's a framework of an outline that we're working on filling in the components of, which will come back to you all when it's done. And our exact timeline on that is driven by grant deadlines and.
There are some things that are driven by grant deadlines, but we're aiming to take the framework to the board in the fall. So the intention with this slide, it was the first time that we've presented an outline of a document that will be what emerges from all of this discussion that we've been having. So we're starting to put pen to paper of what this will look like ultimately. That was the purpose of this slide. Bridget, go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, if I could just echo what Bridget just said, this is very, very ambiguous, so it makes it difficult to engage with. And looking at most of the bullet points there, one of the big questions I have is the definitions of each one of those things, because the devil's in the definitions. And the process has been, I mean, no offense to you, but it's been quite an ambiguous process. So it's difficult to understand how exactly to engage in which component. And just as an example, and also, I would like to remind you, our past discussions about this in the various committees, there's been no unanimous agreement about the various elements in this. It's been a lot of disagreement, actually. And just an example, like the triggers. A big question I have is, are there missing triggers? Because we look at, I think you have drought as a potential trigger. And I wonder if we're missing a land use trigger, you know, or a river behavior trigger. So I just, again, it's very ambiguous. It's difficult to engage with this. And it just seems like there's so many missing definitions that it makes it difficult to think about these things practically.
So we weren't really trying to get you to engage with this whole outline. It's totally understandable that it's ambiguous. We ourselves are wrapping our heads around it. It is a preview of where we're going. The discussion around triggers and the types of triggers and what could be used as triggers is exactly the conversation we want to have today. So I think we should move on to those slides.
Yep.
And then we can get more into that. But go ahead, David. Could you use the microphone, please? I'm sorry.
I'm just, is the last implementation plan supposed to be E or is it starting over again? Is it?
Yeah, it's
Oh.
it's E.
It's E. Okay, okay.
It's not just a circle. We'll get to an endpoint on the thing.
Go ahead, Adam.
This is just me kind of looking at this. And it's good knowing we're going to do A and B next meeting. But it seems like to figure out measures or triggers or any of this other stuff, we have to know A and B. So are we kind of got the cart in front of the horse on this with these? Or with how my mind works, like how do I figure out what to fix if I don't know what to fix?
Yeah, I think at this point, everything that's been, well, not everything, but on the trigger side of things, those were some potential examples. We haven't put pen to paper to say, here are proposed ones at all. So what we're in there, we're just to help you wrap your head around what triggers are and the concept of having triggers. But we will bring out at some point proposed triggers,
Okay,
options
so
that you can compare.
This is the introduction. The next meeting, we look at the conditions and then we'll go back to this on a more in-depth scale.
Yeah, and with the triggers, I think the main thing is the concept that you can move between phases or stages of it, right? That you won't necessarily always be at one place, but if the groundwater conditions get better, then you can, be at a different stage than if groundwater conditions are worse. So right now, I think we're at this conceptual level, and we haven't given you the actual proposed details yet.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It just, I first looked at this and I'm going, I didn't, yeah. You get one side a little faster than the other side. And thank you.
Please keep in mind that the agency needs to move forward and we have our work plan and we're going to continue working. The expectation is not that we can take every single thing that we do through 6 sub-basin committees and get information and feedback on every single detail. Because otherwise we're going to be in year 2040 and we're still talking about it. So you just need to, we want to bring you along enough that you understand how complex it is, how layered it is, how much work goes into that. And we'll be sharing as much information as we have with you. But if you have an expectation that every single chapter that goes into that is going to be fully vetted by each implementation committee, I'm going to be letting you know right now, this is not going to happen. It's like urban water management plans that the urban water districts do. They do not expect every single water user to be part of developing that plan. So I think I'm inviting you to take a step back because there's a lot of work and we have very, very capable team that has done it and will be doing it. And where we come to you is when we have some crossroad and we have a couple of options and it's like, we could do this or we could do that. Help us to understand what's more appropriate for this setting. But this is not new. It's been done elsewhere in the state. This is just a framework. I've said it before. It's like Water Resources Agency did the GMP ordinance. It's a high-level document that says they have authority to do gathering data about groundwater conditions and extractions. How they're going to do it, that's going to be the manual and policy. So compare this with the ordinance, and then there's going to be policies. And those policies we will be developing over the next 6 to 12 months, I'd say, after the framework is adopted. But we just do not have the luxury of or a need to bring every single document to every single committee, because otherwise we're not going to get the work done. So sorry, we are combined here, Dave Seppos. Sarah is the good cop, I'm the bad cop, so I'll step in when necessary.
But Perrette,
Just
that's kind of a unfair comparison because with the GEMS program and that new guidance document that Water Resources created, the whole valley knows, they know the GEMS program. We know exactly what it does, what its purpose is, what it deals with. There's no learning curve at all there. There's a tremendous learning curve.
Well, and my question was, were we getting one part before another? Wouldn't it have been faster to do A and B before C and D? Just because I'm figuring out how you guys want us to look at it.
I mean, I'll chime in like, I think my brain works that way as well. You know, you kind of build the data, build the framework to analyze the data, start asking it questions and get answers. And we're doing that. We're just doing it in parallel so that we can keep these conversations moving. So maybe just to kind of put a punctuation on this part of it is that like, this is the outline of the thing that you're going to see at the end of this process. And there's a lot of detail in there, and let's not get lost in that. I mean, I think bring us back to the main things is, what is the problem, right? What's, reducing some pumping somehow in different ways. How do you do that? Those are the measures. That's what we're going to talk about today. What does that cost? That's what we're working on. That's a big consideration, right? And the fundamental piece of the question that you're asking. And then when do you do those different measures, right? What's the problem? What can we do? When do we do it? What does it cost? Those are the things that we're trying to really focus in on with this group. And then in the background, we're working on like, okay, so if you actually want to stand up a program that is going to do rotational fallowing or some type of fallow bank, like you would need rules. You need everything from like general rules through like a contract that you can actually like who's going to do that? How do you enforce it? How do you measure it if you're going to actually pay people to do it? So those details will go into this document and become part of the implementation step. But we're not there. We're focused on what's the issue, what can we do, what's it cost, when do we do it? I think does that help kind of frame how I see these two pieces? And I get it that you see a lot of bullet points up here and you go, those are just words and fine. So let's not focus on that. Let's focus on the four things that are highlighted, which is really what.
Yeah, I was just figuring out
Rubber
why
meets the
those were
road.
highlighted before the other two.
Yeah.
Because with how my brain works, it's hard to get those four without knowing some of the data from the first two,
Sure. Yeah.
if that makes sense. That's why I was just clarifying how to try to think about it.
I appreciate that. And I think we heard the same feedback, at the last meeting was like, hey, give us more of the, show us the information, show us the data. And we're working on that and we'll be back, to you all to present it.
Okay, and I'll keep this brief, but I think it's important to remember that our careers, livelihoods, and families are depending on this process. And I hope that the way that there's some other parts of the state that have done this, and I hope that's not our example, and that we are able to work together and conquer the best process. And that requires feedback from all the stakeholders. That's all I'm going to say.
I agree. That's a good point. And I think we try to put thought and care into all this work and make sure we're bringing pieces back to you to make good decisions. All right. So again, we're thinking about the when do we do it? And in the spirit of things being out of order, we'll talk about what we can do next, but we're going to talk about when we can do it first. We want to start with this kind of phased implementation planning approach, right? So we've got demand management measures, which fall into two buckets, things that can be done in the short term, right? Like this is stuff that you get on the, from your local, municipal water provider during droughts, right? Like you can cut back on your lawn irrigations a little bit. You can invest in low flow appliances and that type of stuff. Short-term things that can move the needle. And then there's longer-term measures, which is really what we're dealing with for groundwater management, right? Like for seawater intrusion and for some of the other sustainability indicators, there's decisions that are made, years in advance before you see effects on the aquifer, or a year or more in advance. So the measures are kind of grouped into those two categories, things that you can do kind of quickly and things that you would need a longer planning process would have in place and then would take a while before you would actually even see benefits in the aquifer, even if you're measuring, right? And then the two key pieces of this implementation plan are phases. So what's the scope and scale of when each measure would be implemented? And then what are the triggers? So when would you implement different measures? And again, we'll go through what the measures are. There's 6 of them that are on the short list right now. So here's a conceptual overview of what that timeline looks like. And we'll go through what's in each of the concepts for the stages and different measures. So so this shows different types of reduction goals for different types of users. And then these are the measures that we're going to talk through. The 6 of them are listed on this sheet. And then there's different stages where you're kind of at like, low level of implementation effort, kind of voluntary actions, education and outreach, increasing with incentives where there's money and an incentive to adopt practices that are being encouraged. Expanding incentives and evaluation of mandatory measures, which is really, an allocation framework, and then, the fees and penalties and other things that would go if that framework is not working, and other things that we might put into the emergency bucket. So this is how this is the picture that I have in my head, that we have in our head when we're putting together this timeline. So every one of the measures that we're talking about, think about like, what's the appropriate staging? Is it something that should happen before? Like, is it something that should be prioritized because it's either something that can be implemented in the short run or is relatively low cost to implement? And then what are things that you would want to do later or things that might be switched on and off? So within each of the demand management measures, I think I've already kind of covered these points, but if we put the 6 things that we're working on today, the 6 measures that are included in the presentation today, water use efficiency kind of fits under both long-term and short-term measures. There's things that you can do kind of relatively quickly versus longer programs that would need to be implemented to realize any groundwater benefits. And then other long-term measures are really pretty much everything else. Land repurposing, any type of allocation or pumping limits, any type of tiered fee concept, and a fallow bank or rotational fallowing program. Fallow bank also falls under a short-term measure. If you have the program framework stood up, those can be implemented, in drought years. There's been some examples of those across the state and in the Klamath Basin where, in response to water year conditions and you have funding available, you implement a program that can be implemented quickly. However, that's built on, a year or more of work that stands up the framework for the program so that you can actually implement it. Concepts for stages. We've split them right now into effectively 5 or 4 stages with like a baseline condition. So this is really where everything is now, right? There's some initial planning efforts for GSP implementation, like what's the issue? What are the things you can do? What does it cost? When can you do it? Incentivized conservation, I think this is where there's a lot of interest, right? This feels less restrictive than some of the mandatory measures. It's leveraging funding opportunities that might be available. So examples of state programs that have done this recently are Land Flex, and then the multi-benefit land repurposing program. So a DWR grant program and a Department of Conservation grant program, where there are, state external grant funding opportunities to implement pilot programs or to implement land repurposing programs in targeted areas, or to get some, conversion of ag land into other uses. So this is basically getting adoption of water conservation practices through financial incentives. If there's money attached to it, the immediate question is, how are you going to measure and ensure that you're actually getting the benefit that you're paying for? It's important with the state grant program. It's even more important if there's local funding that's going to be used to pay for the program. So stage 2 is some step between incentivized voluntary options and expanding requirements, where you would have more of the demand management measures being implemented, right? So, we're ticking into more of the programs coming online. Those are still being funded and implemented through incentives. So you're short of mandatory measures at this point. Expanding pilot programs into fully implemented programs, right? Rotational fallowing, maybe from a pilot program to something that's available year to year. Stage 3 is a step above that with mandatory. So this would, is where you're looking at allocations and other mandatory measures that are limiting, or outright reducing the amount of groundwater extraction through non-incentive driven approaches. And then the last would be expanding some of those demand management measures, implementing limits, and increasing fees and penalties where, kind of stage 4. So here's an example of how, okay, so those are the stages. And then the last piece here is the triggers. So like what triggers you to move from stage 1 to stage 2? Conceptually, right now, we have 4 triggers. And, in the packet that you were provided and the questions that we wanted to discuss, one of the things we wanted to get feedback on is some of those triggers. I think we had a little bit of discussion about this as part of the discussion about the overall framework. There's 4 things right now. So it's sustainable management criteria. That's what's driving everything, right? Sigma, meet, and ensure that the basin is managed sustainably. Within that, differences in sustainable yield, where you're at relative to the estimated sustainable yield of the subbasin. Water year conditions, which is something I see could be much more tied to short-term actions rather than some of the longer-term actions, right? If water year conditions are under, in a certain condition, that would trigger certain measures that would be implemented. And then the last, which we've discussed at some of these committee meetings, is inter-subbasin effects. It could be on the physical side or as land use and pumping changes across the valley over time. And again, probably something more tied to longer-term considerations of a demand management measure. So let me just kind of recap where this is heading. We're looking for feedback on the triggers and the stages for when these would be implemented for each of the different measures. And we'll go through the measures and then we'll revisit this concept at the tail end of this presentation as well. So let me stop there. And I think we had a couple of questions along these lines and open it up for questions and discussion.
At this time, we do have a couple of questions online.
Okay, thank you, Marita. We're going to start in the room with any sort of clarifying questions or comments from the committee. We'll go out to public comment. Again, we're giving 3 minutes for public comment, and then we'll bring it back for a little bit more discussion from the committee. So I'll help cue you, Marita, for people with their hands raised.
Thank you.
Yeah, so Duncan, when we go to public comment, Emily will need to share her screen.
Okay.
But committee members, go ahead, Mr. Secondo.
Thank you. Just wanted to I heard on the land repurposing, and then after that you said there were some grants for ag to other. Am I correct? I kind of misheard you there.
Yeah, so there's 2 state grant programs that have run recently. There's other kind of flavors, but the big one was LandFlex, which was a Department of Water Resources program. That's done. I haven't heard much recently if they're going to get new funding for that. Looking at the governor's May budget, I don't think that's in the cards in the short term. That was a program that was basically paying for water conservation. It was paying to idle land and then asking people to retire their future allocation. Then the other one is the multi-benefit land repurposing program, which is land repurposing, but it's also got like conversion to other, solar or lower water use crops, and in addition to like habitat and recharge, and I mean it covers like a big blanket of things that can be funded.
That get into land use planning too, that we'd have to get the board of supervisors involved with?
So for those, it depends. So I forget what there is, like 7 or 9 of the block grantees that are working on this. Every plan that I'm aware of looks a little bit different. So in Madera, which I think we've presented to you all on some of their examples for demand management. So in Madera County and their subbasins, their GSA is effectively their board of supervisors, but the plan is approved by them. And then it's implemented at the GSA level. And, as long as and implemented at the GSA level, and that they have rules and a framework and they're soliciting projects from folks, those projects are getting selected. Those don't need to immediately go back to the board for approval. They actually have to go to DOC first for approval for funding, and then they would ultimately go to the board for approval. So those, there's, CEQA or anything that's going to need to be done. And then any permitting and, for, earthwork or whatever you're doing, whatever the proposed project is, is something that the county would have to approve and, you know, make sure that it's actually a viable project.
That's what I was mainly asking about, because that threw me with how we're separate.
Yeah, I do want to chime in here that we do have a multi-benefit land repurposing program here locally that numerous entities are involved with, and Jenny is helping to facilitate. And so we have given a presentation on that before. We can bring that back at another time. I think the approval process will depend on the project. For so not in all cases will things need to go to the county for land use approval.
Okay, that was kind of my curiosity.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Other, Jenny? Go ahead.
Oh, for a question or to speak more to?
Do you have any questions?
Oh, okay. Yes, I do have a question. I just had a question about kind of, and I forget if this has been answered before, but moving through the stages along with the triggers, like if there is, like, do we necessarily move stepwise through the stages? Or is there a scenario in which, like, you know, those example triggers, if we find ourselves in a, you know, triggering something stage 4, like groundwater pumping greater than 30% of estimated sustainable yield, do we just jump immediately to stage 4? Or do we stepwise move through?
Very, very good question. That's something we're talking about, especially in subbasins with undesirable results. You might jump straight in. There's also the complexity of if there are project options or other non-demand management options, it may come down to, okay, what are those other options? What are you pursuing? Are you pursuing a project and this is just an interim measure? Or is this one of your main measures meant to get to sustainability? Ultimately, for each subbasin, we need a path to get to sustainability, right? So this may be in conjunction with something else, and so that'll depend. It is something that we're kind of thinking of as we think, okay, what should the triggers be? What should the stages be?
And then I guess a follow-up to that, just thinking along long-term measures that will take longer to set up, and then the short-term measures. So it seems like if you're going to jump to stage 4, then like the program needs to be fully, or like each measure needs to be fully fleshed out before starting that. I guess I don't know what the question is in there, but like the jigsaw puzzle seems tricky with that.
That's a good term for it, jigsaw puzzle. I think that's something that the board may want to weigh in on, or that we may want to approach the board with later, as far as, do you flesh out all the measures at once? Do you prioritize them? You know, we have already the WUI, the Water Use Efficiency Project. We have the Ag BMP website. You know, there are little bits of things that are starting, but yeah, I think where the time and effort is dedicated and when, it's gonna be part of the jigsaw. So,
Go ahead.
I guess, and maybe this will be determined later, but the one concern I have with triggers in general is the timing of it all. Because sometimes a lot can happen within a short amount of time, like especially like, you know, a heavy winter or whatever. And so is that going to be considered later on, or is that something we should talk about now when it comes to the particular triggers we have here?
I think it'd be great to hear your comments about them now. We are looking for that input.
Well, with like water year conditions, like when do you determine what the conditions are? And then how quickly do you implement the trigger?
very good question. I think we're not there yet because we don't have proposed triggers yet. It is something we'll talk about in a parallel example that we've started to grapple with. That is with the Forebay and Upper Valley and the SMC TAC. And so with the SMC Technical Advisory Committee, you know, we're thinking through, okay, at what point, you know, for them, the reservoir releases matter a lot for their groundwater conditions. And there's already a Water Resource Agency drought TAC, right? So what's their process and timing? And when does that inform what the SMC TAC does and how we look at groundwater conditions? And then how much for measures that they might put in place, which aren't fleshed out, but how much advance notice would growers need before implementing something as well? So in some ways, I think part of the jigsaw is the stages and the triggers, the measures, and then what's the timing, the advance notice on the measures needed as well.
And just to add on one thing, I think you're also tuning into the short term versus long term, right? So you could have a short term decline with a drought, and you could have a heavy water year that rebounds the groundwater levels. And so that would just be like a short-term situation versus how many years do you have low water years? And then, let's say we're looking at sustainable management criteria, right? And so that would be seeing groundwater levels decline over a certain number of years or certain percentage of wells. That would be this long-term trend versus I think a short-term situation where you have a big winter where groundwater levels rebound.
Yeah, I guess like the main thing that you'd have to look at, I think it's like stage 3 when limits get brought into play, because that'll determine which crops you can actually grow, because you're just simply not going to be able to grow some crops. And some of these things are in the ground for potentially years or a year and a half. And then a lot of the contracts that a grower is working with are determined well before we start farming, which is in the early part of the year or the end of the previous year. So the timing thing gets really tricky. I know we're short on time, but like in Huron, they have, we farm in Huron, and we don't actually know how much water we have available until, March. And at that point, so you're so limited in what you can actually farm. So just want to put that out there.
So following up on that, what is the good time of year from your perspective to have that information?
I'm not an expert on crops that are in the ground longer than a year, but I know that there are crops that are longer than a year. But for, I guess, the short-term crops, you would need at least by the previous fall to figure out, to plan accordingly. So fall before the season.
But I think, so as far as the grand vision, the framework will go to the board. We need their blessing to basically move forward with things. And then as Duncan noted, we'll be fleshing out the measures. That's the type of input that you are all the experts on. We're not the experts on. And so we'll need to look and probably have an understanding crop by crop what this looks like, right?
Yeah, I would just add, back to my initial, there's a few things moving in parallel. So, there's outreach, one of us or somebody else at our shop that is ongoing as we speak to talk to folks about some of these issues and make sure that our analysis to provide costs for you is, grounded in good data and understanding of the systems. And that informs, this is a good discussion and question, like when, what's the timing for when things could be implemented? Those types of conversations will inform, I think, some of the framework elements that will go in there. Won't be decided, but it'll lay out like, hey, here's the issues that you have to figure out if you're going to have a trigger and a timeline associated with it for a specific measure that we're looking at.
Go ahead, Mr. Beth.
But then you also have to add into that lease negotiations, which occur before the farmer knows where and what is going to happen. So the availability or the lack of availability of water needs to be known before the lease negotiations.
And that's in the summer, depending on how long the lease is.
Depending on how long the lease is,
Yeah.
depending on the relationship, that's all over the place.
So if I may just sort of probe on this a little bit more, Mr. Bunn. So there's a pathway for your decision-making. How does the water year factor, or you're not going to know if it's going to be a dry year or not. So there's some of that uncertainty already built into your decision-making, I'm asking. I mean, how are you already factoring in those kinds of considerations?
Not at this point, not currently. But if you start going down this road, then that choice in relation to the water year, whatever else is going on with the triggers, if it is going to mean that GSA is going to say, we're going to have some allocations instituted here, how are you going to decide that? Then in the lease negotiations, that might mean that a strawberry guy would walk away from it. And on top of that, the row crop guy is going to change how he's thinking about planning ahead for the next X number of months.
So perhaps there's two places of feedback that we can incorporate this. One is the specific measures as those get fleshed out and the timing of those. Well, one is the triggers overall. One of is the specific measures. And then another would be as we get into which measures to implement or which to prioritize. There may be pros or cons of different ones, giving the timing of those specific measures.
Could be. Adam?
Just one thing I thought of when they're talking here, it seems like part of it, one of the triggers is basically how much water was used over the sustainable yield. That's based on Jim's data. That data gets reported in November. They don't have that back till February or March. You're putting your first crops are already in by then, and sometimes some guys are starting to put in a second crop if they're doing spinach or a faster crop.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's good. I mean, I'm thinking this one is actually more of like a long-term average type thing where you're looking at your annual report or 5-year updates and looking at where you're at as an estimated annual, because you can't, I mean, that's not something that you're going to be able to track year to year like that.
It'd be better long-term because Jim's short-term, I don't know how you do that.
Yeah, that's how I was thinking about it. I don't know, Abby, with the modeling and the.
Yeah, and this is going to be different for the different triggers and probably different parts of the valley. So for example, in South Valley, we see responses to reservoir releases pretty quickly, right? And responses to droughts or lack of reservoir releases as well. And that's a pretty quick response that we see. Other things are more long-term, where you have, sustainable yield or multiple years of having many minimum threshold exceedances, right? You're in an area that needs to get to sustainability, and work harder. It may look different in different areas. And some of the things may be more long-term where it's not a turn on and turn off, right? It's let's do this for a couple of years and then let's reevaluate where we are and adjust it as needed. And then in the future.
Yeah. Just a couple comments about the triggers. First comment, if you have triggers that are not the SMCs, then you have to make the justification and the logical connection between that trigger and how it links back to one of the SMCs, one or more of the SMCs. That makes your conversation harder. So those triggers that are not SMCs are slightly more ambiguous. But then also, it seems like you're missing some triggers. Because if you're going to include water year conditions, then you have to have, I think you have to have river behavior as a trigger also. And then also, in addition to that, I think you have to have land use as a trigger. Because the setup to ignore it is odd, because all of the serious demand management measures that you have are really about land use. They're land use decisions. Fallowing, that's a land use decision. Pumping allocations, that articulates into land use because it changes how you use the land. So we're happily or unhappily talking about applying those kind of land use decisions on one side of the coin with this demand management discussion, but we're ignoring land use decisions on the other side of the coin here. Because for instance, if Salinas builds 20,000 new units, that's a land use decision the city has made, but it has direct repercussions on groundwater. Same thing if Gonzales decides to expand, or if grape acreage goes out of production in South County. That's a land use decision, but it affects groundwater use. And there's a lot of other examples I could come up with. Converting grazing land to row crops, all land use. So again, there's a strange disconnect here because we're talking about demand management decisions, which are land use decisions, but then we're ignoring other kinds of land use decisions and how they add to the overall equation of what affects groundwater in the valley.
So I'm going to stop you there because I want to make sure everybody else is having an opportunity to make comments. Are there any other committee members that have any? Go ahead, Mr. Scatini.
Yeah, the interbasin studies or interbasin, how does that apply to this? Will it apply at all, or would interbasin modeling in regards to your stages and how it moves around?
So the Interset Basin computer modeling is something funded by the Alliance and the Coalition. It's between the two of them informing each other. At this point, it's not part of the GSA process. It is what they wanted to reconcile. The GSA has a process whereby basically anybody can fund the model being run in certain ways, and that's what they've done. There's a separate process, a second part of the process, whereby they can bring it back to the board if they think it's informative for the GSA.
Could you speak, Abby, a little bit to what's on the slide, though?
Sorry.
Yeah, that was a different
Totally
question.
wrong, inter-subbasin. We use the term in many ways. Ooh, my bad. Inter-subbasin effects. So the question of how, now I'm totally lost.
I think you answered a good question on the modeling side. Maybe I think you were just asking about how does this, so this to me is a trigger that needs to be better defined, that captures conversations that we've had and some that we've already started to look into on if you do something different in one part of the valley, right? If, say, you're at a different stage or there's a different trigger that's implemented, how does that affect cropping and land use decisions, which I'd argue is driven by the economics of the things that you're able to farm? And how do things move around, right? It's kind of like whack-a-mole. If you implement, even within a sub-basin, if you implement a certain policy, folks respond to that by changing land use, that's going to affect your water use, and you need to have some consideration of that for how you trigger different actions. That's the idea. Was that the question that you answered or asked? Yeah.
Been done or going to be done will be used in determining how you work with these stages of implementation of demand management. I don't know.
I'm going to add to that, yes and no. I think it depends what modeling is useful as a predictable prediction, but then ultimately we'll be assessing the results based on what is happening on the boots on the ground. And we've been kind of saying sub-basin, it may need to go to a smaller regional scale because our sub-basins are pretty complex and not necessarily the same conditions and triggers may apply across a sub-basin. Let's take 18400. If you look at very north, what is happening there, we may need to activate certain measures just in that region. So this inter-sub-basin effects could apply from a sub-basin to sub-basin, but it also could apply from a region to region if certain demand practices in an area cause negative adverse impacts to a neighboring region, something may need to be done to avoid that or reverse that. So we are looking, how do we quantify it? So is it SMCs? Is it if a, and back to the comment earlier, we are not land use jurisdiction. That's not something we can put on ourselves as a criteria. We deal with water. So if the land use decisions trigger, again, negative impacts, adverse impacts to water demand, then that's when we step in. If they don't, we don't get into land use. But if they do, that's our kind of where we can say, you have to do something because you're causing either negative impacts here to your own usage or you're causing negative adverse impacts next door. So, but how do we, that's where we would kind of need all of your collective brain power is how do we quantify it? What's a good measure? Is it 10%? Is it 20%? How do we measure it? Is it the RMPs? Is it a subset of an RMPs? So we really kind of, that's where we need your input is not all of the pages in that framework, because we're pretty confident that we can author that and don't need a whole lot of, because it's not first time Duncan and team has done it. But where we need your input is this table. How do we come up with those numbers that are good enough to stand as a framework? And then every time when the trigger gets hit, it goes to the board. And now board has the menu options to choose from. For example, and if we are in stage 2 in this region, let's look at the playbook. So we pull out the framework, and in the previous page, there are 2 back. We had we have options now that we know we have kind of modeled would give us the results. So we go to that, and the board will decide what out of that to implement. It's not that it automatically triggers something because those are programs. So we have to run them. We have to set it up. We have to enforce them. Some of that may be, oh, we are in stage 2. If this happens next year, then this is what we're going to do 18 months down the road, 12 months down the road, 6 months down the road. So none of that is a switch off, switch on, except very few things. So I think if you think about it, it's very complex. We realize it. So we're starting with baby steps. We are going to hope to have a framework that give us just some structure to this, how to run a very, very complicated program. And then we're going to be asking the board, now you have the framework. Out of those 6 measures, what do you think we should be working on next to really flush it out? So how do we do rotational fallowing? Is it crop-based? Is it region-based? Is it both? How do we set it up to be successful and get the results, but also cause you the least harm the groundwater users here? So those are the types of things that we really, really want your, not that it's not going to work, but how do we make it the best program we possibly can, considering what you know about the local conditions? So I think that TBD is here. You know, if you have any questions, any comments, it doesn't have to be during the meeting today. You know how to reach us. If you have any ideas of how to, you know, have you considered this? Could it be this? Could you start something not in stage 3, but maybe that is more appropriate to start that in stage 2, because it is easier for us to make that change on the ground. Or no, that's a kind of hard one to start in stage 2. We would need, you know, at least 12 months heads up, and that can inform our planning, our business. So I think that's where we really kind of want to spend the effort and energy of making it a workable. And even then, we can set up a program and then we run it once and it's like, it didn't work. It didn't work the way we planned. Then we go back and change it again, because there's no point of carrying out a program that is not giving us what we need and is harming the business and all of your businesses. So I think it's a teamwork, and I really would like you to kind of see it as such, that we want to do the best possible approach for all of you. We're not operating in a vacuum here. We're not doing it for our own sake. We are doing it so we will all have sustainable groundwater in the future. None of that is our preferred method to go to. Neither are the projects, but we have to do something. So trying to tease out of it, if we had to do something, what would be the most palatable and most viable and most practical measures of doing that? So yes, it's complex and it's complicated, and we talk about it day in, day out. We have so many team meetings in the background, and a lot of work is being done, and that why you see kind of pieces coming to you, because we know we are at a place where we need your input in certain areas. So that's what we bring to you. And so.
Go
Yeah,
ahead,
I
Mr. Bunn.
just want to finish.
ahead.
What I just heard was that you were trying to segregate demand management from land use. And I'm telling you, it can't be done. They're together. So just a statement.
Mr. Bunn.
Yeah, just, I'm not sure from the introduction if this is off limits, or because I'm a little confused by what you want us to talk about and not talk about. But my question is, can you, on the triggers, can you take into consideration people who are already conserving water well versus maybe a higher average, and have a differentiated cutback based on that? Is that something that that seems that would be, if not, you're kind of punishing people who are already conserving? And that's one comment. And then are the percentages, the 10% through the 30%, are those just placeholder numbers at this point, or are they numbers that are linked to their placeholder numbers?
Yeah, those were,
Okay.
I think, finger in the air, just to put something on the paper to help you wrap your head around what triggers are.
Okay, got it. Okay.
Go ahead, Mr. Breen.
Has there been an analysis of just how much, I know there has been, we have a certain amount that's over our sustainable yield that we're pumping. And so it would seem to me that Sigma affords us the opportunity to go below our SMCs in certain drought conditions and things like that, to where I think we need to tailor this thing to where we need to just get ourselves to a sustainable yield type of pumping thing through incentives. And I would just, I'm not a farmer, I'm in water district, because I think this is more tailored towards a drought response plan. And I think we're triggered. We're in a critically overdrafted basin. We need to push a program out that's going to allow the business people to make their own decisions. So that's just my comment.
Before I go to you, Mr. Chichi, are there any other committee members who haven't commented yet? Go ahead.
So I'm just, so where would groundwater levels be as far as a trigger? Because when you're
That's in the
Where-
sustainable management
So
criteria.
that would be sustainable management
Yep.
criteria. Okay. And
There,
then,
there would be stages set by where you are in relation to your minimum threshold or measurable objective.
because that's really the bottom line, right?
It's one approach, depending on
For the
measure.
east, yeah, for the east side. So because I guess like I think it's useful to look at like the result and then people can kind of figure out how to get there versus having to follow and monitor the behavior of people who, to Mr. Bunn's point, like David's point, might already be doing the right thing. So, just wanted to put that.
Yeah,
out.
that's helpful. At this point, I think we should pause and give the public an opportunity to speak. We've got a couple. Oh, Mr. Merhart, before we go to the public, go ahead. Oh, you're muted.
Okay,
We can hear you now. Go ahead.
if we handle water differently, in, for example, say we spent X amount of dollars, it could be expensive, but long term, it makes sense to handle this water a different way, to where we might take water, it's going, in other words, we might introduce more water into the soils, which would be more efficient, but I don't know how we're going to measure that. But it's a process we're thinking about it. In other words, of making better use of the water you have. And that's something that came up where we might invest $1 million to do that, but it would help northern Salinas Valley.
Okay, thank you. And we'll go to the public now. We'll start with Mr. Farrow. And we're going to pull up a timer. You have 3 minutes.
Thanks very much. I'm going to try not to use all my time. I had a question early on. Somebody said the framework is not going to be fleshed out by this fall. And I'm just curious how and when the staff will be in a position to compare demand management options to the other PMAs, which is supposed to happen in early 2026. I presume that in order to make that comparison, there'll have to be some sense of what measures would be implemented, what the groundwater effects would be, and how much they would cost, which is essentially the parameters against which you would judge them against other projects. So I'm curious about the schedule for getting to a point where comparisons can be made. And if staff could address that, I'm happy to yield the remaining 2 minutes and 14 seconds.
Thank you. I think our intention is to have that level of information incorporated as part of the work to be completed this fall. And so it may be that we haven't completely built out how a program would be implemented, but we should have enough information to be able to compare the costs and benefits of different demand measures, to be able to also compare those costs with projects as options. So that's our goal. So the next commenter is Ms. Isaacson. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Nancy Isaacson. And so some of the comments that I want to make have already been stated, but I just wanted to reiterate. One, I think that it's helpful, certainly for me and maybe for others, to have a reminder each time of what it is that we're solving for. Is it the groundwater levels increasing, reducing seawater intrusion? How does that relate to the sustainable management criteria, which up here you have to be determined in each stage, and that would be helpful as a reminder of what those criteria are and how they may be utilized. And that really goes to the same with the inter-subbasin effects. Same thing is how could they be used? We're not necessarily a one size fits all, as your general manager said. We could even be looking at smaller areas, but it's important to understand from my perspective, in any event, my opinion as to what we're solving for. And then that would help us get our arms around how we could best frame it for where. With as far as the drought, the water year conditions, you list the Bonner County Water Resource Agency drought reoperation plan. Might be helpful to share that if you haven't already shared it with everybody, because there are some specific criteria for determining when that trigger is pulled and how it's pulled. And I think that would be helpful information to share with everybody as well. And again, I guess it's just we do need to work together. We're not necessarily a one size fits all. There's going to be different tools or triggers, whatever you want to call them, for different areas, different subbasins, certainly within different, potentially within smaller areas within a subbasin. But it's a good job, but I think there is more information and just a reminder of what we're solving for so we can help to understand how we can move that forward. Thank you.
And the next commenter is Tom V. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Tom Versick speaking. Three things. One, the queries that I don't recall who, but at the very beginning, one of the staff people responded that Mr. Sippos had sent out some queries and responses, and I don't think that's in the agenda packet. So what was being asked and what people said, I think should be part of the public record. Two, recently DWR had a press release about something called the PMA module. That's projects and management actions on their Sigma dashboard. That is potentially something some of those on these committees may want to look at, because it's a tool that allows you to navigate into the specific GSPs and the PMAs that are there, and you can find out in a way that's a little easier than looking at 8,000 pages of 6 GSPs, which forms of demand management for our purposes are in which of the various basins, or what we call subbasins, because they overlap, they separate. There's a lot of nuances there to find out which ones are even remotely applicable in which areas. And they go under slightly inconsistent labeling too, so it's not always super great. But one can learn more about how they're presented in the GSP. It's summaries. So it's not quite a glossary, but I know people were asking, what do these words here mean? Well, that's one place you can go to see how certain words are explained in the GSPs around demand management. And the only one that to me looked fully voluntary was the one that was called fallowing, fallow bank, and agricultural land retirement. That's what it's called in the PMAs. And my third and last comment is an observation that, I'm combining Chris Bunn's, very important comment about the leasing and the dynamics with that, and your general manager's somewhat bad cop sort of approach, and then finally Patrick Breen's reality check that it really is the industry that needs to figure this out. My observation is that it's been well over a whole decade since Sigma was passed, and if at least some parts of the industry are still trying to catch up and understand what Sigma is, and that the status quo shall not continue, that suggests there's a huge amount of catching up to do. And basically the committees could do a lot more by spending the time and effort on their own to get ahead before they come to these sorts of meetings, to protect themselves. That's all.
Okay, we don't have any other hands raised online, but we have one in the room. And can you please use the microphone?
Good comment. Yeah, all good comments all the way around. I'm not sure what packet you all read. I really don't. Maybe you didn't read it. I'm not making that accusation, but there was a lot of detail in there. And to all the rest of you folks on the committee here, I really only, except for a couple, all the voices are from the Alliance. It's all really coming from the same talking point sheet. So I really hope the rest of you step up and make your voice, express yourself. You're on this committee for input. I can only do it as a member of the public as well as a couple of us. So we only get very short snippets to chime in, but we hope and pray that all of you participate in this very important conversation. You know, there's been talk today that this discussion is too vague, that there's nothing real in front of us. But I've read the packet, every line, several times now, and I'd ask, what more do we need to begin? Page 29 details a fallow bank estimated at $43 to $60 per producing acre in the 18400 with a $4 to $5.5 million cost to reduce use by just 5%. Page 28 models how a $300 extraction fee could idle thousands of acres. Page 31 shows that in the east side, pumping's at 10,000 acre feet more than the aquifer can sustain, kind of to Mr. Breen's point. You know, let's work on getting that down to the sustainable yield. These aren't ideas, they're actual numbers and they're tools ready for hands. So I thank the staff and the consultants for doing a lot of hard work here. Unfortunately, you spent about 30 minutes at the front of this thing talking about, I don't know whatever they were talking about. And the hydrologic model makes it plain. On page 13, a 30% reduction in pumping brings total withdrawals down from 146,000 acre feet 102,000 acre feet per year. It's not guesswork. That's a scale of impact that we need to look at and talk about, and a kind of clarity already available in section C that was in your packet. We start there because that's where we can act now, while sections A, data inputs, and section B, accounting systems mature. They're being developed. They said that. This is phased implementation by design. You don't wait for the last nail before raising the frame. So I ask, are you ready to do the work that will fix this valley, especially your area of the valley in the 18400? I might even say west of Davis Road. Or are you just guarding your pile of money, managing your cash flows that you've been very successful at for the last 100 years, and watching your bottom line? It was mentioned several times again today about lease contracts. I don't care about lease contracts. We need to fix this problem because all that, the land, the assets, your field forecasts, your plans, it's all vapor. It's like chasing after the wind. But to restore a basin, to get back what's been drawn down and you've taken your share,
Your
is a
time is
different
up.
kind of work, and it's
Chris-
above the sun, it endures,
Chris-
and it is good.
Thank you. Okay, so wanted to just follow up on one comment by Ms. Isaacson. You know, the intention of bringing the problem statement to this conversation was in part to really frame that, what are we trying to solve for discussion. We know that those statements are going to continue to need some work. They've been discussed at the advisory committee. We got some really good feedback on them there. But I think everyone can look to those statements as well as the sustainable management criteria as the sort of the key issues that we're trying to solve for here. And with that, I think we need to move on to the measures. We have 40 minutes left in the meeting. I'm going to ask if Duncan can go through these slides at a relatively quick pace. We may not have as much time for discussion as we would like, but let's try to get through these next sets of slides and then have discussion about the measures themselves.
Before I go through them, can I pose the two questions that we're asking? So Dave in advance sent you around some questions to think about, key areas where we'd like feedback. And so I'm going to pose them and then Duncan will talk and then we can circle back. One is, do the proposed DM measures include all relevant options? Are there additional types of demand management that should be considered? So are we missing anything? And do you have comments or questions about the cost, benefits, or key considerations associated with the proposed DM measures? Just to get you thinking as he's talking. Thanks.
All righty, on we go. And I think the only thing I would add to the kind of background here is that, I mean, I think part of the other reason to do this work is to keep management local. I mean, having seen the state board process play out in a few other subbasins. That's not fun. So I think what we're trying to do is understand things that can be done, what those cost and what the regional economic implications of those different measures are. So we're working on all those things in parallel. So again, taking a step back, well before we were doing anything here, there was this planning for uncertainty series of workshops where different demand management measures, kind of abstract measures, were discussed. And so if you go back to the end of the year last year, the first time that Brooks and myself were here, we kind of distilled those down and we went through what they are, kind of binned them. There was some things that kind of overlapped. And then we came back and talked about them in a few other meetings. And when I boil down the discussions that we've had, internally and with you all, and look at what the suite of actions are, they really boil down to these 6 things. This is what's included right now in this framework concept. There's this, one bookend, which we've already talked about, some type of pumping limits or extraction limits. Those are, a pretty blunt instrument, right? And something viewed as something to be avoided, viewed typically in discussions as like a mandatory measure. So put that as one bookend, number 5. And then everything else in here, with the exception of 6, which is really tied to 5, right? Penalty charges is like, how do you enforce something? And then there's a related question with that, which is like, what do you do with any money that's gathered from penalties? Those can be used to fund other projects and things, but put that on the side for a second. The other 4.5 measures are in that incentive-driven kind of voluntary bucket, right? Things that are generally viewed as lower cost. Sometimes there's grant opportunities that are available, like we talked about, to implement some of these things. And those are on-farm water conservation. Doesn't have to just be on-farm, could also be domestic or self-supplied users. Groundwater extraction fees, rotational fallowing or a fallow bank program. I think these get discussed as 2 different things. They're really one and the same. It just kind of depends on how you set the program up. And then land repurposing, which we talked a bit about earlier. There's a lot of discussion around the state about that because there's grant money that's been put in place for a land repurposing program that's being implemented in different areas, including here in the Salinas Valley Basin. Yep. So we are working on the economic analysis of each of these measures, and we will come back to you all with what they cost, on a unit cost basis, as well as the regional economic implications of implementing these things in different ways. I think as we've kind of discussed, in my mind, that helps kind of inform a portfolio. It certainly feeds into some of the feasibility studies for projects. These are fundamental data points that you need for the feasibility analysis, whether it's done from a federal perspective or just from a local feasibility study perspective. So just kind of keep it in folks' minds that like there's kind of a few parallel paths moving forward, and these pieces all feed into the questions that we're discussing that I've heard discussed at the committee today. So what we have today is we're presenting the shorter version. There is a few more slides in your packet that have some additional detail, and we'll step through each of these 6 measures real quick, as Sarah mentioned, and then we'll stop and have some discussion. So first thing is, we'll focus on farm. You could expand this to some, residential measures as well. But the question is, are there things that can be done on farm to conserve water? And if so, what are those practices? What are those BMPs, and what do they cost? And so there's really kind of 3 questions. What do they cost? Already addressed that. What can be done? And then what's the ability to adopt those practices, to scale those practices up? So here's a snapshot of ongoing analysis that's looking at that question. So on the left, this is just looking at from real remote sensed ET data, just looking at the distribution of, I believe this is what, spring lettuce fields?
This is double cropped lettuce fields in Eastside.
Okay, there we go. So this is a subset for one specific crop and rotation over the year and looking at the distribution of ET. So kind of controlling for climate, right? Is there some variability in crop water use? So yeah, there's a distribution. There's abilities to affect water use on farm. This question came up earlier. It's like, what about folks that have already made some investments in practices on farm? Like, how do you recognize that? Good question, something to think about. But I think what it tells us is that there is some opportunities for additional investment. So the question is, what are those different best management practices? Here's just a snapshot. This is an example from the GEMS report listing different practices. In my head, they kind of start with very simple things like just measuring, and kind of managing what you're using. Like even just the ability to look at and understand your use affects your usage. I mean, we see this with like our energy bills when you get an insert in there that tells you how you compare to a group of your peers. If folks get those in the PG&E service area, yeah. And my house always fails. I don't know who my peers are, but like but like it does make you think a little bit, and you like you turn the air conditioning up a little bit or whatever. And then you can kind of go down the list into like specific practices on farm that are gonna vary by the cost is going to look different for different growers, what you can actually do, where you're at, what you're growing, what your equipment is. But there is, it's not full adoption of BMPs. So there's an ability to expand BMPs. So one way to do that is through incentives, right? So you encourage additional, we can do it through education and outreach, which is a relatively low cost way. Just like let people know that here's things that can be done. Here's what here's what you can be doing. Here's what it costs. And we're working on that information. And then if you want to accelerate that, you can tie some money to it, to actually, there's programs that pay for implementation of expanding best management practices. I think the big considerations for this is that, there's already pretty good adoption of a lot of practices. So there's some limited potential for water conservation. Those costs might be non-trivial. We're looking at that right now, but we'll come back with you all with some estimates of what these practices costs. And then the last piece is we need to understand what those effects would be on groundwater. And Abby at the part one of this meeting previewed some of the blanket kind of groundwater modeling estimates under different percent demand reductions applied across the basin. A more precise estimate would say, okay, if these practices are implemented, given what cropping looks like and where those would be implemented, like how much does a 5% savings or a 10% savings or a 2% savings in different areas of the subbasin affect the sustainability indicators? And then where do you get best bang for your buck for making those investments? And what other areas have done and considered is like using those to like using that understanding to like tailor incentive programs. So like areas like the Napa Valley subbasin that are interested in management for like river flows are looking at opportunities like, well, what if you target programs to get those practices implemented, within 500 or 1,500 feet of the river? Because that's where you actually get your big effects on the thing that matters for complying with SGMA. So that's just kind of an idea to plant in the back of your head that is something we can think about as part of additional economic analysis and the hydrologic analysis that'll go into this program. Okay. Second, and these are not in any order. These are, there's 6 of them in no particular order. But we've talked about a groundwater extraction fee. So a fee is a pretty simple concept. It's a price mechanism to disincentivize over use of water, right? I mean, if you charge somebody something for something, they're going to potentially use a little bit less of it. I think the big issues with groundwater extraction fees, particularly applied to ag, is that there are, as you all know better than me, there are other considerations that are going to be other market considerations and costs that are going to be driving farming decisions. Water is typically a pretty small share of the overall budget, especially at what you're typically talking about for a fee to be set at. So I think the real interesting element to this measure is what a groundwater extraction fee could be used to fund, in the way of other projects or investments. We've looked at examples a number of months ago now when we came and presented to you in other areas where the concept is a fee would be used to partially fund like a fallow bank program, right? Or some type of rotational fallowing program. So there's kind of equity and fairness issues there, but the general idea is charging an amount, even if it's a nominal amount that's not going to have much of an effect on pumping. Pricing does have some effect, right? But then there's a pool of money that can be used to fund other implementation activities. I think the big issue here is we've already talked about measurement, reporting, and accounting. And everything I'm talking about here, I'm glossing over, the procedural steps that need to be in place to establish a fee, right? To actually charge for extraction and then what that money can be used for, and making sure that there's a reasonable cost or benefit nexus. So this is actually already out of date on the left because we've made a lot of progress on modeling work, but just gives you kind of a rough sense like, hey, if we look, sub-basin wide and look at hypothetically, different levels of assessment, like how big of an effect does that have on overall farmed acreage, right? So holding all the market conditions constant, holding other prices constant, holding other regulatory costs constant, like how big is the effect of an additional charge? How much land doesn't get farmed? So you can see how the framework we're putting together will help us analyze like two things. How much money can you gather through a fee and what could that be used to fund? And then what's the effect on farming practices in the subbasin? What's not shown here, which is part of the work that we're doing, is what are the regional economic implications of those changes, right? So if we're talking about farming a few hundred or a few thousand less acres, that has an effect on the overall water balance, right? It's a demand management measure, but that means fewer jobs, less income, has an effect on tax base and land values and so forth. And that's part of the economic impact consideration that we're looking at for this program. Related concept that we've talked about is a rotational fallowing or a fallow bank. I kind of see these as the same thing. I think we've talked about a few different flavors of it here, where it might be something that could be tailored seasonally, or it could be something that, as we discussed earlier, applies under different water year conditions, either short or long run conditions. Maybe it's triggered differently. There's certainly examples of these programs, both in California and in other areas in the West that have been implemented in response to drought conditions, where there's a pot of money that's used to effectively pay for not farming. That's what these programs are doing. How they're set up affects what the program costs. There's kind of two general ways that these work. One can be where there's an offer that's made by the agency that's running the program, of a flat amount to see how many acres actually elect to participate in the program. Another way that these have been set up is, through a bidding mechanism where there's no offer, there's a pot of money or a target of water savings that an agency is looking for, and growers submit bids at different levels, and then the lowest bids are selected. So there was a drought water bank, which is effectively a fallow bank program that was run in the Klamath Basin for a number of years. That's how that was set up. There was bids that were put into the program, amount of money and water that they were looking for, and you select the lowest cost bids. So that's a way to lower the costs. Rules, management, and funding mechanisms are a big issue with these programs. I think some of the ones that we talked about as examples in the Central Valley, there's a lot of work, many months of work that go into defining how the program works, who's going to manage it, and how you enforce it. And a big piece of the enforcement is measuring, right? Like, how do you ensure that you're getting the savings that the program is paying for? And then how do you fund it? If there's external grant funding, it becomes a little bit easier. If it's funded internally through, say, an extraction fee, then there's fairness considerations. Like if you elect into the program, do you no longer have to pay a fee at all? Are you no longer paying for the overall management of the basin? Well, the short answer is probably not. You're still kind of part of the collective management, so you need to make some adjustments so that that's done in a fair way. I think the other note here is that these can be kind of done flexibly. If you look across the state, the subbasins that are doing them, you've got within a county, one subbasin managing a program and another that's not, or within a GSA that has this program in place and one right next door that doesn't. So you can kind of tailor it to local groundwater conditions. The table on the left gives a high level overview of just very rough numbers. And again, these are only direct costs. It's not dealing with any of the regional economic effects. These are very rough numbers in a model that's not fully calibrated yet, which we're still working on. But it kind of gives you a rough sense of what a program like this would cost. So if you're looking at a 5% reduction in cost per producing acre in the $40 to $60 range to fund a program like that. The land repurposing concept, I think we've talked about this a lot. Maybe there's three elements to this. There's the programs like I talked about, the multi-benefit land repurposing program, which is kind of paying for water savings and some other, defined co-benefits that are specified in that grant program. And the idea is taking currently in that example, it's focused on irrigated ag land, taking currently irrigated ag land and transitioning it either into a lower water use crop or other land uses, for anything from solar to habitat to, basically anything that provides other co-benefits. So it's a little bit more, in contrast to like a fallow bank, it's the examples that I've seen, they're typically externally funded through some type of grants, and it's more of a permanent or a longer term, program. So that multi-benefit land repurposing program is a minimum of 10 years. Some folks are looking at permanent transition, but it would be a program that pays for those longer term benefits. I think the other way that land repurposing comes up is twofold, and we discussed it the last meeting, and we've already started working on it, is if a demand management measure is implemented in certain areas, how does that affect cropping decisions in other areas? It's a market, land moves, contracts move, right, to some extent. And then what is the actual potential so that's one. And then the other thing was, what's the potential development pressure on existing ag lands looking out into the future? So we've pulled in the geospatial data from the general plan and then just looked at that with current cropping data and soil and slope and some of these other farming conditions to look at what the potential for currently farmed land to shift into other uses might be, and then what the potential for land in different areas to shift to other parts of the subbasin. That's part of the ongoing outreach right now that when we're talking to folks and doing some one-on-one interviews, that's some of the data that we need to get a better understanding of, and we can, we'll be back to you all to present on some of those results. So there's other points with land repurposing, external funding. I think I already covered that, and the scope is really limited by funding. I mean, these are typically pretty expensive projects because you're effectively acquiring an easement for a period of years or in perpetuity. Assume that somebody sneezed. Keep going. Pumping limits, everybody's favorite topic, allocations. So, on one hand, like everything that we're talking about for demand management, if these different measures are implemented at different times and there's triggers, there was a discussion earlier about concerns, what I heard, kind of like, uncertainty, right? Like you need to know in advance to make farming decisions. And so on one hand, allocations kind of solve some of that problem, right? You know what the answer is and how much is available, and decisions can be made with that. On the other hand, these have very real effects on land values pretty much immediately, right? You see it in the San Joaquin Valley. And they're also hard to stand up because, Sigma isn't dealing with water rights. It's, you can layer a system under Sigma that's basically limiting extractions, right? And you got to do that in a way that's kind of fair. There's equity issues, and the programs that are working out there right now took a long time to put together, and there's plenty of legal challenges for all of them, as far as I'm aware. I'm not sure that I'm aware of one that didn't have some type of legal challenge. But how do these work in general? I mean, simple way is, slicing up the sustainable yield of the basin by acreage. Other ways you could do it is you could think about historical water use, which gets at questions of investment in conservation practices historically. Other things that have been done across the state is to look at the additional pumping over and above the safe yield or sustainable yield and call this like a transitional water bucket, basically, some planned overdraft that's going to continue, and allocate that potentially in a different way, and then slowly ramp that down over time so that you allow folks time to adjust. So, this is one of the 6 elements or measures that are included in the framework. The table on the left shows the, very kind of rough terms, what the sustainable yield is and average pumping, kind of give you a rough sense of the scale of the difference, which we were just talking about earlier, and current footprint acreage within the GSA. That's just the footprint. That doesn't account for multiple crops per year on the same piece of land. And then the last one is really kind of related to all the others. It's like an enforcement mechanism. How would you get people to comply with things where you have a charge for overuse or a penalty for not complying with the program? And it's typically, I've seen this, it's typically set up with an allocation. How do you establish what the penalty would be? Typical way to do that is to set it based on a replacement cost, right? Like if what's the replacement cost of an alternative supply? That can be pretty substantial in some areas. I think in the first or the second meeting that we were at with you, we went through what semi-tropic water storage district has for its proposed penalties this year, and that's like well north of $1,000 an acre foot, which is tied to its effectively, they call it their landowner water budgets. It's effectively an allocation system. And then the table on the left is really just it's just a example. There's no real numbers in there that tie back to anything going on in the valley here. So yeah, just to recap and then open it up is these are the 6 measures that are boiled down from a discussion on planning for uncertainty and the series of committee workshops. I mean, we think that most of those discussions fit into one of these 6 categories. As Abby mentioned at the beginning, one of the questions is, do you agree with that? Or do you think anything's missing? If so, let's talk about it and make sure that it gets in there. And then what we're doing for each of these is coming up with what those direct costs are, how the program would look, how it could actually work, what it would mean, and the regional economic implications of it and impacts, because that's feeding into other work on projects for their feasibility studies, as well as just overall planning for for cost-effective implementation of the GSP, which was something that we heard a comment earlier. So let me stop there and hand it back over to the team, or open it up for questions.
Okay, so go ahead, Mr. McIntyre.
Thank you. Listening to everybody today and last meeting as well, and thinking about my own scenario on the east side, there's a climate of resistance. I mean, let's be honest, this is not something that we want to do, but I think it behooves us to accept the fact that under certain conditions, we're going to have to do this. And so I think for all of us, our operations, we ought to be considering what that looks like for us. What's the best 6 of these 6 measures? I'm sure there's other measures that's going to work in our scenario at our farm. I mean, everybody's different, permanent crops, whatever. But I think if we have a little bit more, little less resistance, more acceptance, perhaps we can get through this process a little easier. There'll be plenty of questions along the way. But, right now I feel like it's more of an educational process. But when you throw resistance in there, it's hard to learn anything. So that's my 2 cents.
Go ahead, Mr. Barnes.
I'll just chime in real quick. On the incentives deal, I think that's something that, obviously is very attractive to farmers. And there's a lot of people without outreach and educational events that, you learn a lot. I learn a lot from what other people are doing. But the one thing, like there are smaller farmers that may not have the funds to buy the proper equipment that the bigger guys have, such as, it's time of the past, but drip tape, right? Some people still are not using drip tape, which they have their reasons for it. Maybe they just can't financially afford the equipment. But if there's, throwing out their grant programs of, hey, I see you using, 3 acre feet over here and your neighbor's using 1. Well, why? Well, I don't have that equipment. I can't source this. I'm, small farmer, that type of thing. I don't know. I just think that would be something. And the one thing that caught my eye, number 6, penalty charges. I noticed there's a penalty for going over, but you don't get the credit for going under. So something, if that ever happened, you should get rewarded for doing better.
Thank you, Mr. Bunn. Go ahead.
I don't think this is a separate measure, but it might fit under a couple of them, but maybe the consideration of a water market. So if there's situations where, or scenarios that play out where people are not able to farm all their acres, but they still have some water available on their land or their acreage, could they possibly sell that to another farmer? So it might fit. It'd be like a subsection or kind of a tag along to some of these concepts.
Yeah, and the water markets, I think it would fit under that pumping limits number 5, right? Because the kind of the fundamental piece of any market is you need to define what, what it is you have to sell, and it's got to have some type of property right, for lack of a better word. Yeah, and those are kind of thought of as a way to increase flexibility under an allocation. And we can certainly include some notes along those lines in this framework document, and there's a lot. I mean, there's a lot to talk about there. I think some folks around the state have evaluated those, and looked at ways to kind of make it easier and flexible. And then in other areas, it's just, they kind of pop up organically. Like I think I have Madera as an example in mind that has an allocation in place. And, they did a big study on a water market when they were working on their allocation system, and ultimately kind of put that on the side. Like there's a study that was done. There is no water market there, but the way they designed their allocation was they set up this concept of farm units, which allowed flexibility within landowners or even non-contiguous parcels. And then kind of the ability to buy and sell just kind of comes up, organically, right? The market works if there's an economic incentive. So, but that's a good point that we can add to the mix under item 5. Yeah.
I was just going to comment on that real quick. It's similar to Huron, right? On how they, you got your water, and then if you don't use it all, you could sell it, you could keep it, you could roll it in. There's a lot of stuff that you do for Huron and San Joaquin Valley on that type of stuff. So, and they're like, what, 20% allocation? Or now we got 40% maybe this next year.
Okay, we'll go to Ms. Rochichi and then Mr. Segundo.
I guess my question is, in your experience, for I think it's most relevant to extraction-based fees or limits or what have you. I assume that there had to be like a level of accountability with reporting how much water you're using. So is that typically just electric flow meters, or what do you see? What was the requirement in order to have that accountability?
Yeah, I mean, areas that I have in mind have typically kind of gone with a few different approaches. So like Madera is a good example. Theirs is measured through satellite, and they have 2 different companies that are providing that service. And then, but if you don't agree with that, you have the ability to measure through a flow meter or through a flow meter and basically protest, right? Or you could report through that way as if your protest is successful. So kind of all 3 options are on the table. I think the big thing with that is just making sure that it's consistent units, right? I mean, one's measuring the net amount, used, transpired, and evaporated, and the other is measuring what you're actually applying to the land. So the accounting needs to match the measurement. And then other areas that are doing fees, a lot of them are doing acreage-based charges because of the complexity with measurement and lack thereof. And then fairness issues, like, I don't know, I'm thinking of areas like Sonoma Valley, like, oh, well, some of us dry farm, like, okay, so, should you pay? Well, you're still using groundwater, so like to get around that, you just go kind of with a acreage-based assessment, which maybe doesn't have that tie to disincentivizing water use, right? Making you think more and be more efficient, but it's what a lot of areas have done.
There's just like the one concern, because the GEMS reporting, which I think is the basis for all the water use on the ag side, I think sometimes having done those forms, I could see where there could be some confusion reporting the water use, especially if people don't have flow meters, or if they're sharing, if there's sublease situation, they're sharing wells, and so it's rather ambiguous. And the main thing there is, as long as there's a solution going forward, but the big concern, I think, is historical context, and if that was ever to be used as a benchmark, then we should probably reconsider that.
Mr. Secundo, and then we'll go to Mr. Merahart online.
Thank you. On number 4, when they had the slide that showed more on there, you mentioned development opportunities. And this is where it seems like we need the Board of Supervisors involved a little bit to find out what those carrots could be, what those options could be. Because right now, what can we develop on ground without the Board of Supervisors permission? This GSA doesn't seem like I was told earlier, it couldn't do that. So how do we get the board? Let's find those carrots because they're there. Even if it's houses or a winery or something, it gives stabilization of water use for that property that won't go up in the future, which could be a good thing. But it'd be nice to know the carrots. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Merahart, please go ahead.
Thank you. If we're successful on the Somerville Road area, which is under study, and we put the rubber dam in, get it approved, it's going to help the east side, part of Salinas, and possibly even some of Blanco. There's 1,600 feet of water there, and we'll keep it recharged by dam releases. That's the overall plan. We'll see how it works out, but it is doable. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Crispin.
Are you thinking about this for the whole valley? Is this an all valley approach? Obviously, the examples in the presentation are just specific to the 180, 400 and the east side, but in the Upper Valley and Four Bay committees, none of this stuff really has been presented. So is this truly being thought of as all valley approach, or is just the north?
The framework, yes, it's the agency-wide framework, and it allows for flexibility from a region to region. So we are trying to kind of get the specifics for what applies across the whole valley and what needs to be unique to each sub-basin or region. But the framework, that kind of is one of my goals, or why it's a good thing to have, that it applies to the whole jurisdictional area that we're responsible for. And also, I know we've talked about the SMCs as what problem we're trying to fix. That's the most burning, but also it allows for that what if something happens in the future, that we have a playbook to go to. So what if we get into a 10-year drought? What if there is another earthquake? What if, so it's the emergency operations plan, that it's not another document we need, but the same framework could apply for both, trying to address. So very likely the South Valley could be in stage 0 to start with, because of the triggers. If we set them up, they're in stage 0, therefore one set of measures will apply to them. And then let's say Eastside is going to be in stage 2, according to the triggers. So they have a certain measures that need to be applied there. So that's kind of my thinking, how it could be both nimble and flexible to address a uniqueness, but also kind of we are all in it together.
Mr. Bramers.
So, Brett, and it's been mentioned a few times, but you meant your description there makes sense. But you've mentioned like areas of subbasins. Are you really planning? I mean, will we have the data? Will we have what we need? Because all the triggers are SMC, which are subbasin wide. Water budgets are subbasin wide. I'm just concerned we're going to even shrink it even smaller.
Great question. We would like to be as flexible as regional. We don't know if we have the data and if we can really make it happen, but we'd like at this point not exclude it as a way to implement it. So we need to kind of put more thought into that.
Go ahead, Mr. McIntyre.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, John, that in the Four Bay, we have the Arroyo Seco management area, which is a smaller area and undoubtedly is in better shape than some of the outlying parts. So I can see where we might have some smaller regional areas in the future that we'll find. So
that one's a known and existing area, though. We're talking about defining new. non-existent areas or finding them that may exist. So, okay.
Go ahead, Abby.
Yeah, I guess that's just a recognition that, we're seeing differentiation not just along the subbasin lines, but in even within subbasins and not according to those lines. So we're thinking about what's appropriate for what areas, not just with the political boundaries. Also horizontally, yes, as far as different aquifers. Yep.
I think one example that comes to mind for me in the 18400 is the CSIP area, because the CSIP area has already invested in a in-lieu supply project. You're not having as much private pumping. And so some of these measures might not be applicable to people who are paying for CSIP. And so that's a sub area. It's not a management area, but it is an example of how the 18400 is not uniform across the subbasin. And then the other example in the 18400 that we've discussed in the 5-year evaluation is the northern rural residential areas that likely won't receive any benefits from a project that would address seawater intrusion, but has documented overdraft in the land use plan for that area. So we might want to look at that area differently, or we would like to look at that area differently. But it's a rural residential area, so some of these measures might not be that applicable to that area. So that's the kind of nuance of within the subbasin that we're contemplating. Not super simple. I'm going to go to Mr. Scatini, and then we're at 2:58. I've got 2 hands raised online in the public. So if you could make your comment brief, and then we'll go to the public.
That's a quick question. Demand management would apply in CSIP, or is that, what's that look like?
So I think if you're receiving an in-lieu supply, that is a demand management action that has been taken. You've invested in a project. There are, however, some constraints within the CSIP system. So there might be some unique and specific things that the CSIP users would want to talk about. The scheduling system that the Water Resources Agency is working on is an example of a demand management measure specific to CSIP in order to be able to distribute the water and not come up against the pressure issues that are arising. So I think that's a separate conversation within the CSIP users that we would want to have with Water Resources Agency. Yep. Okay, I'm going to go to the public, and online we have Mr. Farrow with your hand raised. Please go ahead.
Yeah, real quick, 2 comments. One is, although I appreciate that the tiered pricing and the fallowing don't include the costs, the indirect costs, they are incredibly cheap compared to the cost of projects. Both of them generate water in the order of magnitude of $50 an acre foot or less, which is a fraction of the cost that we're talking about for project water. So I think those are great places to start, and I'm glad to see that that's based on at least some initial analysis of presumably people's willingness to pay. I've heard a lot of comments that talk about fairness. If I use less water, I shouldn't be paid as much, or I should be paid for it, or if at tiered pricing, the guy next to me who's pumping twice as much as I am should be paying more. I guess I just want to point out that the reason this will come up is that we'll need to apportion the cost of whatever is done. If you're raising money to fund voluntary fallowing, you need to, charge somebody for that. And when you apportion on any basis the cost, you are effectively making a pumping allocation. Now, your allocation might be, sort of an unfair one, which is to charge by acre, but it also might be to charge by acre foot. And then the question is, where's the break? Do you pay more after you go over a certain tiered number? You're basically then creating pumping allocations. And I think that needs to be recognized, that however you fund these projects, there will be effectively pumping allocations, and it's time to get started thinking about the basis for making those. Thanks.
Okay, and Ms. Isaacson, please go ahead.
Thank you, Nancy Isaacson, Salinas Valley Water Coalition. Questions. One on the enforcement and the penalties. I'm just wondering, do they really work or do they just allow those who would rather continue to pump and pay the penalty and accept that as a payment? Not that that's going to be a lot, but I think there are cases where that would be. So it seems like it would have to be something other than just the fee, that if there was a continuation of exceeding a certain amount, if you go that way. Coalition has never supported allocations and or the pumping fees. So I do want to state that up front as well. But if you're going to do that, there are other considerations that should be made. And, looking at the data and the discussion on smaller sub areas from the sub basins, um, previously Bulletin 52 has been mentioned often, and I believe it's Bulletin 52 that actually carved up the pressure area into three areas, P1, P2, P3, and the east side into two areas, E1, E2. I could have it reversed, could be east side 3 and the pressure area 2, but they were looked at individual separate sub-basin sub areas because of differences. So there is historical data to support looking at that, as well as now that I'm thinking about the historical benefit analysis that the Monterey County Water Resource Agency has done. They looked at things on 13 subunits within the whole of the valley. So there actually probably is more data out there than we know about. And so I would encourage you to take a look at some of that as well. Thank you.
Okay, is there anyone in the room? Go ahead, Mr. Light. Could you please use the microphone?
Yeah, be sure to cut me off. Sorry about that last one. Yeah, just touching on what Nancy raised. I'm not making it up. There's actually, I believe Howard Franklin, probably about 8, 9 years ago, shared in one of his presentations on the subbasins in the valley. And I think they have like 33 documented areas within each of what we know as either what the original map was that included the Arroyo Seco cone or Bulletin 52. And I admit, I didn't like the idea of using Bulletin 118. I had a concept that I put out to the Farm Bureau directors and to others that were interested that drew it down to the actual APN lines, drew the boundaries by APN line based on what we knew about science. Didn't go very far, but that's not a surprise. But yeah, the water acts differently. And I think Mr. Merhart did a great job actually of explaining to you, as he's explained a number of times to this committee and others that are willing to hear him out, that his ranch is uniquely positioned on the south side of the clay lens that goes down 1,600 feet, I believe is what he's talking about, that 1,600-foot wall that really is an almost completely impervious, maybe 2,000 to 4,000 acre feet a year get through it from the forebay and waters above. That's how it's always worked. It's not something new. The problem comes back to, we have a critically overdrafted basin. I think it was stated a couple times. You don't just have water levels, you have seawater intrusion upon which 200,000 people rely on for a drinking water system and backup drinking water system. And it's nobody's water except the people's water. Landowners have access to it. And I believe the term I believe someone's raised here before is beneficial and reasonable. It's not just about beneficial use. Yeah, I'm growing food for the world, but I'm also destroying drinking water system for 200,000 people that live here, and a good chunk of whom probably work for you too. So there's always that to consider. So good luck. It was I think your consultants and your staff are doing a great job. They're trying to present it to you so you can talk about it. And we can foot drag all we want. We've seen it before. Maybe I've even been guilty of it myself. Certainly not perfect, but it's 10 years now. You got to pick up the pace and you got to participate in these things and offer some ideas so your staff, your team here can put something together that you can live with. Or you may end up living with something you don't want. Thanks.
Okay, so we're 6 minutes over time. I do want to just acknowledge that we're over time. Couple more comments and then I just, oh, go ahead.
Thank you, Sarah. Just quickly, we've been talking a lot about the conditional nature of demand management. And I think we need to recognize that if we get the right projects in place, demand management could go away. And I want to address something that Mr. Farrow said, because it's also important to recognize that demand management just addresses groundwater levels, which proxy for supply, but it doesn't address saltwater intrusion, right, Abby?
Correct.
So we got to keep that in our thinking.
Okay, I want to thank everybody for their time. I want to thank Duncan especially for his presentation. We are planning to come back in July. I believe our admin staff has been finding a date for that meeting. At that time, Duncan will present more of his results for the economic modeling and the next level of this framework that we started discussing today. If you have any comments that you were not thinking of in this meeting that you want to send to us afterwards, please send them to us. Me, Emily Perrette, will convey them to our consultants. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to the committee chairs.
Okay, thanks. So,
Oh, yes, I'm sorry.
Uh,
Want to clarify one thing. Thank you, Emily. We have a meeting scheduled in June on other items, June 9th. The next demand management meeting will be in July, just to clarify. Thank you.
thanks. So both agendas will have the same. So, thanks, everybody. Yeah, I mean, this is a tough one for everyone. So, but we'll move along. Thank you. So we'll go to 5 informational items. I don't see any. Staff reports, none. Committee reports, none. Future agenda items, they're on the agenda. And you just heard a couple more. And so we'll go ahead and adjourn the 18400 just to make that one official.
All right, and just before I adjourn the East Side, I want to say thank you. Appreciate you guys, the work you're doing. And I appreciate the logic and the approach that you're taking. So I don't envy you this task. I don't envy any of us this task. But anyhow, thank you all for sticking around. So we're all adjourned.